My father didn't raise his voice often. That was part of what made it land so hard when he did. "You have 2 days," he said, each word measured, controlled like he'd rehearsed it. "Pack your things, leave the keys, and don't make this ugly." I had just set my duffel bag down by the door, still smelling faintly of jet fuel and desert dust, still carrying a body that hadn't quite learned how to be home again. My mother stood behind him with that soft, careful expression she wore when she wanted to look reasonable while saying something unforgivable. My sister leaned against the counter, smiling like she'd already moved her things into my room. And I stood there in the entryway of the house my grandfather built with his own hands, listening to the sound of something breaking that no one else in the room could hear. I didn't argue. I didn't ask questions. I didn't even blink right away. There are moments when your training takes over before your emotions can catch up, and that was one of them. In the army, you learn quickly that reacting too fast can cost you everything. You learn to assess, to observe, to wait. So I waited. I let the silence sit between us until it became uncomfortable, until my father shifted his weight slightly like he expected me to fill it with protest. "You heard me," he added, quieter now but sharper. "This isn't up for discussion." "I heard you," I said. That was all. My mother exhaled like she'd been holding her breath. "Emily, we're trying to do this in a way that's best for everyone," she said, gently stepping forward just enough to seem compassionate without actually closing the distance. "The house is too much for you to manage alone, especially with your schedule, and with Chloe getting married." "With Chloe getting married?" my sister repeated lightly, pushing off the counter. "It just makes more sense. You're barely here, Em. It's not like you even live a normal life anymore." There it was, the part they wanted me to react to. The part they had probably talked about ahead of time, sitting around this same kitchen table deciding how to frame it so it sounded like concern instead of strategy. I looked at Chloe. She was wearing a white sweater that looked brand new, her hair curled just enough to feel intentional. She looked like someone preparing for a future that had already been arranged for her. And maybe in her mind it had been. 2 days, my father said again, as if repeating it would make it more real or more final. I nodded once. "Okay." The word landed in the room in a way none of them expected. My father's brow tightened slightly. My mother blinked, her expression flickering for just a second before she smoothed it back into something softer. Chloe's smile faltered just enough to show confusion beneath the confidence. "You're agreeing?" she asked. I said, "Okay." I stepped past them, moving deeper into the house, the familiar creak of the floorboards grounding me in something steady while everything else shifted. The air smelled faintly like lemon cleaner, and something floral, my mother's touch layered over years of something older, something that belonged to my grandparents. That smell had always meant home. Now it felt like something being overwritten. Behind me, I could hear them exchanging glances without speaking. They had expected resistance. They had expected emotion. They had expected something they could point to later and say, "See, this is why we had to do it this way." What they didn't expect was silence. I walked into the kitchen and set my hand on the edge of the counter where my grandfather used to stand every morning reading the paper with a cup of coffee that always went cold before he finished it. For a second, I could almost see him there, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes sharp despite the years. "You're taking this surprisingly well," my mother said behind me. I didn't turn around right away. I let my fingers trace the worn edge of the wood, feeling the small grooves and imperfections that came from time and use, from living. "I've had worse conversations," I said finally. That was true. My father let out a short breath, something between irritation and relief. "Good," he said. "Then let's keep it that way. Pack what's yours. Leave anything that belongs to the house." "Anything that belongs to the house," I repeated more to myself than to him. "Yes," he said. "Furniture, antiques, anything your grandparents intended to stay here." I almost smiled at that. Not because it was funny, but because of how carefully he chose those words. Intended to stay here. As if intention was something he could define now. "I know what belongs here," I said. There was a pause, a small one but enough. "Good," my mother said quickly. "We just want to avoid any misunderstandings." Misunderstandings. I nodded again, then reached for the cabinet where the coffee mugs were kept. My hand moved automatically, pulling out the same ceramic mug I had used since I was a teenager. It had a thin crack along the handle that had never quite broken all the way through. "Emily," Chloe said, her voice lighter now, almost teasing, You're really just going to leave, no fight, no speech. I glanced at her over my shoulder. Would that make this easier for you? Her smile returned, but it didn't reach her eyes this time. Not easier, just expected. Then I guess I'm not in the mood to meet expectations today. I filled the mug with water and set it in the microwave, the soft hum filling the silence that followed. It gave me a moment to think without them watching my face too closely. Because the truth was, there was something they didn't know. There was something upstairs behind a wall they had always been curious about, but never understood. A safe my grandfather had installed years ago, the kind that didn't draw attention unless you knew exactly where to look. They had always assumed it held something valuable, something worth taking. They were right. Just not in the way they thought. By the time the microwave beeped, I had already made my decision. I would pack. I would label boxes. I would move through the house like someone preparing to leave. And I would let them believe they had already won. Because sometimes the fastest way to lose control is to think you already have it. I took the mug out, wrapped my hands around it, and turned back toward them. "I'll be out by Friday," I said. My father nodded, satisfied. My mother gave me a small, approving smile. Chloe looked almost disappointed. Behind all of them, the hallway stretched toward the stairs that led to the second floor. Toward the study. Toward the safe. And by the time my mother started calling me later that night, her voice tight, asking if I had found somewhere to stay, if I needed help, if we could talk about this like a family. It was already too late. By the time they gave me those 2 days, they believed the story was already written. In their version, I was the difficult one, the distant one, the daughter who chose a life of uniforms and deployments over family dinners and predictable routines. It made things easier for them, that way cleaner. If I had been the one who left first, then what they were doing now wouldn't look like abandonment. It would look like adjustment. But that wasn't how it happened. The truth is, I didn't leave this house. Not really. Not in the ways that matter. Even when I was stationed across the country, even when I was halfway across the world, there was always a part of me anchored here. In the walls, my grandfather painted himself in the porch boards my grandmother used to sweep every morning before the sun fully came up in the quiet rhythm of a place that had never needed to prove its worth to anyone. My grandfather wasn't a loud man. He didn't give speeches. He didn't repeat himself. When he spoke, it was usually after he had already thought something through, completely the kind of thinking that didn't need to be explained because it had already been decided. Character shows up when it's inconvenient, he told me once years ago when I was still trying to figure out what kind of officer I wanted to be. Not when it's easy, not when people are watching, when it costs you something. At the time I nodded like I understood. I thought I did. I didn't not fully until much later. It started small. It always does. My grandmother forgetting where she left her keys, leaving the stove on, asking the same question twice in the span of 5 minutes and then laughing it off like it didn't matter. My parents called it normal aging. They said everyone goes through a phase like that. But it didn't stay small. I was in my 2nd year of active duty when the calls started coming more often. Not from my parents, from neighbors, from the pharmacy down the street, from the home nurse who had been hired quietly without much discussion. She missed her medication again, the nurse told me one afternoon while I was sitting in a briefing room, trying to keep my attention on a screen full of logistics data. And your grandfather, he's doing his best, but he can't keep up with everything. I remember stepping out into the hallway, pressing the phone tighter against my ear, feeling the distance between where I was and where I needed to be like a physical weight. "I'll handle it," I said. And I did. At first, it was weekend trips. Red-eye flights, rental cars, quick drives from the airport straight to the house. I would land, go straight to the pharmacy, restock what was missing, organize pills into labeled boxes, write instructions in large, clear letters, and tape them to the cabinet doors. Then it became more frequent. I started adjusting my leave time around doctor appointments. I learned the names of medications I had never heard of before, learned how to read lab reports, how to ask the right questions without sounding like I was panicking. My grandfather never asked me to do it. He never had to. "You don't have to come," every time he told me once, standing in the kitchen while I rinsed dishes that had been sitting too long in the sink. "You've got your own life." "I know," I said. He watched me for a moment, then nodded like he understood something I hadn't said out loud. "Still," he added quietly, "you're the only one who does." That was the part no one else ever saw. My parents had reasons. They always had reasons. There was a business trip, a client dinner, a fundraiser that couldn't be missed. My mother spoke about those things the way some people talk about emergencies, urgent, unavoidable, more important than anything happening quietly in a house by the water. My father was worse in a different way. He didn't pretend not to see it, he just chose not to engage with it. "We can't drop everything every time something small happens," he said once when I called to tell him my grandmother had wandered outside and gotten lost for nearly an hour before a neighbor brought her back. "You're overreacting." "Getting lost isn't small," I said. "It is if she came back," he replied. "We'll deal with it when it becomes serious." I didn't answer right away because I didn't know how to explain something he had already decided not to understand. It was already serious. Chloe, on the other hand, treated the entire situation like an inconvenience that disrupted her plans. She came by once, maybe twice during those early months. She brought flowers, took pictures in the garden, posted one online with a caption about cherishing time with family, and left before dinner because she had reservations in the city. I remember standing at the sink that day, watching her through the window as she laughed on her phone, her voice bright and effortless. "This place just feels old," she said, not even lowering her voice. "I don't know how they stand it." My grandmother was asleep in the next room. My grandfather heard every word. He didn't say anything then. He rarely did in moments like that. But I saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his shoulders squared just slightly, like he was bracing himself against something he couldn't stop. That look stayed with me. It came back more often as time went on, as the days blurred together into routines that felt less like visits and more like maintenance, as I became the one who knew which bills needed to be paid, which pipes needed fixing, which neighbors could be trusted to check in when I wasn't there. I wasn't living in the house, but I was the one holding it together. When my grandmother passed, the house went quiet in a way that felt permanent, not empty, just different. Like something essential had shifted and couldn't be put back the way it was. My grandfather changed after that. He became quieter, yes, but also sharper, more focused, like grief had stripped away whatever patience he had left for pretending things were better than they were. 2 weeks after the funeral, I was helping him into bed when he reached out and caught my wrist, his grip firmer than I expected. "They think I don't see it," he said. I knew immediately who he meant. "I don't think they're trying to hide it," I replied carefully. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh, but without any humor in it. "They're not waiting for me to get better," he said. "They're waiting for me to be done." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and undeniable. I didn't argue, because I had seen it too. "I'm not going anywhere tonight," I said instead. He studied my face for a moment, then nodded, releasing my wrist. "I know," he said. "That's the point." That was the night I understood something I hadn't been ready to admit before. This wasn't going to end the way my parents thought it would. It wasn't going to be a quiet transition, a simple transfer of ownership from one generation to the next, wrapped in polite words and family obligations. It was going to be a test, not of who was related, but of who had actually shown up when it mattered. And in that test, there was only one answer my grandfather trusted. It wasn't the one my family was counting on. A week after that conversation, my grandfather asked me to drive him into town. He said it casually, like it was nothing more than a routine errand. "I need to stop by an office near the marina," he told me over breakfast, his voice steady, almost too steady. "Just some paperwork I've been putting off." I didn't ask questions, not because I wasn't curious, but because I had learned over the past year that when he chose to explain something, he would. And when he didn't, it was usually because he wasn't ready for anyone else to weigh in on it yet. The drive was quiet, the kind of quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, just focused. The road curved along the water, the late afternoon light reflecting off the surface in a way that made everything look softer than it really was. We pulled up in front of a small brick building with a brass plaque by the door. No flashy signage, no oversized windows, just a name. Daniel Mercer, estate attorney. Inside the office smelled faintly of paper and coffee. The kind of place where time moved slower, where conversations weren't rushed because they weren't meant to be. "I'll wait out here," I said, gesturing toward the row of chairs along the wall. My grandfather shook his head. "No," he said. "You're coming in." That was the moment I understood this wasn't routine. Daniel Mercer was older, maybe late 60s, with the kind of posture that suggested he had spent decades listening more than speaking. He stood when we entered, shook my grandfather's hand, then turned to me with a brief assessing look that lingered just long enough to register something before he nodded. "So this is Emily," he said. "Yes," my grandfather replied. "This is the one I told you about." There was something in the way he said it. Not proud, not emotional, just certain. We sat. The conversation that followed didn't move quickly. It wasn't meant to. Mercer walked through documents, timelines, options. He asked precise questions. He listened to the answers without interrupting, then wrote things down in a neat, deliberate hand. At first, I stayed quiet, absorbing what I could, piecing things together as they unfolded. Years earlier, my grandparents had drafted a will. A simple one. The house and most of the estate were set to pass to my father under the assumption that things would follow a predictable path. That family would behave like family. That assumption had changed. "Circumstances evolve," Mercer said calmly, sliding a document across the desk. "And sometimes so does the need for protection." Protection. That word landed differently than anything else he had said so far. My grandfather leaned back slightly in his chair, his eyes fixed not on the paper but on me. "I'm not doing this to reward you," he said. "I want that clear." "I didn't think you were," I replied. He nodded, once satisfied. "This is about making sure what matters doesn't end up in the wrong hands," he continued, "and making sure the person who understands that is the one in control." Mercer tapped the document lightly. "An irrevocable trust," he explained. "Once established, it's not easily challenged. It places the property under a structure that requires oversight, documentation, and clear authority. And that authority would be, I asked, though I already knew the answer." "You," Mercer said simply. The word hung there for a second, heavier than it should have been. "You would be named sole trustee," he continued. "That means you control how the property is maintained, whether it's sold and under what conditions. It also means anyone who wants access would have to go through you, legally." I looked at my grandfather. "They're going to fight this." "They might," Mercer said. "But the structure itself makes that difficult. And the documentation we're preparing—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "It will make their arguments weaker than they think." My grandfather didn't look at Mercer when he spoke again. "They already decided what this house means to them," he said. "I'm just making sure they don't get to decide what it becomes." There it was. Not anger, not revenge. Clarity. I signed where Mercer told me to sign, watched as the notary stamped each page with a finality that felt both quiet and absolute. The sound of it, sharp, precise, echoed in the room like a decision being locked into place. On the drive back, my grandfather was quiet again. But it was a different kind of quiet. Not the heavy one from before. Lighter. Relieved. "They'll hate you for this," I said at one point, watching the road ahead. "They'll hate the boundary," he corrected, "not the truth." I let that settle. By the time we got home, I already understood what came next. Not confrontation. Preparation. Over the following weeks, Mercer and I handled everything carefully. Transfers were recorded, documents were filed, copies were secured in places no one in my family knew about. Nothing was announced. That part was intentional. "They'll show you who they are more clearly if they think you're unprotected," Mercer had told me during one of our last meetings. "People don't hide their intentions when they believe there's nothing stopping them." He was right. After my grandfather passed, the shift was immediate. My mother started asking more direct questions about the house, about the paperwork, about whether anything had been updated. My father became more involved than he had ever been before, calling, stopping by, walking through rooms like he was measuring them for something. Chloe took it even further. She talked about renovations, about color palettes, about modernizing the space. She sent me photos of kitchens she liked, layouts she wanted to try, as if the house had already been transferred, as if the future she imagined was already guaranteed. I didn't correct her. I let them all move forward under the same assumption. That everything would eventually belong to them. That I was just a temporary inconvenience. That assumption gave me something far more valuable than confrontation ever could. Time. Time to prepare something they would never see coming. The safe in the upstairs study had always fascinated them, not because they knew what was inside, but because they assumed it had to be important. So I made sure it was. Inside, I placed everything they would need to understand exactly what had happened and exactly what they had lost. A notarized copy of the trust. A letter from Mercer confirming its validity. A sealed envelope with my grandfather's handwriting on the front. A flash drive. And on top of it all, a single sheet of paper placed where it would be the first thing they saw when the door opened. I chose the words carefully. Simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. If you are reading this because you came looking for something to take, then you already know why you were left out. I closed the safe and locked it. Then I waited. So when my father stood in the kitchen and told me I had 2 days to leave, I didn't argue. Because the deadline wasn't mine. It was theirs. Friday came colder than the rest of the week, the kind of gray afternoon that made the water beyond the trees look flat and metallic. The house felt different that day. Not tense exactly, more like it was waiting. Every room held the same quiet, the same stillness that settles in before something irreversible happens. I had packed enough to make it believable. Boxes labeled in black marker books, winter clothes kitchen, a suitcase near the door, a few empty spaces on the shelves where things used to sit. Anyone walking through would see exactly what they expected to see: a woman preparing to leave. What they wouldn't see was everything that hadn't moved. What they wouldn't see was the fact that I had already decided I wasn't going anywhere. They arrived just before 5. My father came in first, keys in hand, posture straight, controlled, the way he carried himself when he believed he was about to resolve something efficiently. My mother followed, a step behind, her expression already arranged into something that could pass for concern if you didn't look too closely. Chloe came last, her heels clicking lightly against the floor, her eyes moving quickly across the room as if she was already imagining it differently. "Is that all?" she asked, glancing at the boxes. There was a faint edge of disappointment in her voice, like she expected more. "It's enough," I said. My father set his keys down on the table and looked around, once taking in the scene. "Good," he said. "Then let's not drag this out." He didn't ask how I was. He didn't ask where I was going. He went straight to the point. "The safe," he said. "We should go through it before you leave. Make sure everything is accounted for." There it was. Not a question. A step in a process he had already decided belonged to him. "It's in the study," I said. "Same place it's always been." He nodded, once already moving. I followed at a distance, not close enough to look involved, not far enough to miss anything. My mother hesitated for half a second, then went after him. Chloe fell in behind her, her curiosity no longer hidden. The study hadn't changed. The same desk, the same shelves, the same faint scent of old paper and cedar. It was the one room in the house that still felt entirely like my grandfather, untouched by anyone else's version of what it should be. My father went straight to the desk, opened the top drawer, and took out the small key that had always been kept there. He held it up for a second, turning it slightly between his fingers, as if confirming something to himself. "Convenient," he said. I didn't respond. He moved to the wall, pressed his hand against the panel I knew he had always suspected concealed something, and slid it open. The safe sat behind it, solid and unremarkable, its surface dull from years of being left alone. For a brief moment no one spoke. Then he inserted the key. The click was quiet, almost insignificant. But it was the sound everything else had been waiting for. He pulled the door open. At first nothing happened. He stared inside, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable from where I stood. My mother stepped closer, her heels softer now against the rug. "What is it?" she asked, her voice lower than before. He didn't answer. He reached in and took out the top sheet of paper. I watched his eyes move across the line. I watched the moment it registered. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sudden movement, no sharp intake of breath. Just a subtle shift, the kind you only notice if you're looking for it. The tightening of his jaw, the stillness that followed. My mother took a step closer. "What does it say?" she pressed. He handed it to her without speaking. She read faster at first, then slower, then again like she was expecting the words to rearrange themselves into something more acceptable. Behind her, Chloe leaned in, impatience replacing curiosity. "Can I see that?" she asked, reaching past her mother to grab the document. "What is this?" she demanded, her voice sharper now. "What does irrevocable even—" She stopped mid-sentence. For the first time since they arrived, the room went completely silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from people choosing not to speak. The kind that happens when no one knows what to say. My father reached back into the safe and pulled out the envelope with my grandfather's handwriting. He opened it more roughly than he intended, to the paper tearing slightly along the edge. He read it without moving his eyes, scanning quickly, then slowing. My mother's hand trembled slightly where it held the documents. This can't be right," she said. He wouldn't do this without telling us." "He did tell you," I said quietly. They all turned at once. Not because I raised my voice. Because I hadn't needed to. Chloe shook her head, already retreating into denial. No, this is manipulation. You were here. You were the one handling everything. You could have—" "Finish that thought," I said. She didn't. My father hadn't looked at me yet. He was still reading, still searching, as if there might be a sentence buried somewhere in the pages that would undo everything he had just learned. There wasn't. My mother found the flash drive next. "What is this?" she asked, her voice thinner now. "Play it," I said. She hesitated. For a second I thought she might refuse. Then she crossed the room, inserted it into the laptop on the desk, and clicked the file. The audio started with a soft crackle. Then my grandfather's voice filled the room. Older, weaker than it had been years before, but clear, steady, certain. "I am making this recording because I want there to be no confusion about my decisions," he said. "I am of sound mind. I understand exactly what I am doing." My mother closed her eyes. Chloe took a step back. My father finally looked at me. Not with anger. Not yet. With something closer to disbelief. "He said you would try to argue," I added, keeping my voice level, "that you would say he didn't understand what he signed." The recording continued. "I am not confused," my grandfather's voice said. "I am not being pressured. I am protecting what matters from people who only see it as something to take." The words settled into the room with a weight none of them could push back against. "I chose the one who showed up," he finished. No one spoke when the audio ended. My mother turned slowly, her composure gone, now replaced by something rawer. "Emily," she said, her voice breaking at the edges, "what did you do?" "I followed instructions," I replied. Chloe shook her head again, faster this time, like movement alone could undo what had just happened. "This isn't over," she said. "We can challenge this. We can—" "You can try," I said. My father closed the safe door with more force than necessary. The sound echoed slightly in the small room. For the first time he looked smaller. Not physically, but in the way people do when the outcome they assumed was inevitable slips out of reach. They left 10 minutes later. No speeches, no arguments. My mother forgot her purse and had to come back for it. My father didn't look at me as he walked out. Chloe did. If anger had a temperature, the room would have cracked. The door closed behind them. The house went quiet again. And then my phone started ringing. The first call came less than a minute after their car pulled out of the driveway. I watched the screen light up on the kitchen counter, my mother's name filling the space where her voice had been just moments earlier. I didn't move. I let it ring. Let it go quiet. Let it start again. By the fourth call, I picked up, not to answer, just to listen. Her voice came through immediately breathless, stripped of the careful tone she had worn all week. "Emily, don't do this," she said, words tumbling over each other. "Please, just wait. Don't file anything else. Don't talk to anyone. We need to handle this as a family." I said nothing. There was a pause on the other end, the kind that comes when someone realizes they don't control the conversation anymore. "Emily," she pressed softer now. "Are you there?" I ended the call. The phone rang again within seconds. Then again. Then again. 30 minutes. That's how long it went on. Calls stacking one on top of the other, messages following in between, first urgent, then controlled, then urgent again. "Call me back. We can fix this. You don't understand what you're doing. Please." I saved every one of them. By the time the calls stopped, the house had settled into a different kind of quiet. Not the tense silence from before. Something clearer, cleaner. The next move came exactly the way I expected. Legal. My father filed a petition within 3 days. It was structured the way Mercer had predicted: clean language, reasonable tone, built around one central claim that my grandfather had not been in a sound state of mind when he signed the documents, and that I had exerted undue influence while acting as his primary caretaker. On paper, it looked controlled. Measured. Concerned. In reality, it was desperation with better formatting. Mercer called me the morning after the filing. "They've made their move," he said without preamble. I figured. "Good, then you also know what comes next." "I do." A hearing was scheduled within weeks. The time between moved differently than the days before the safe. Slower in some ways, sharper in others. Every interaction mattered. Every word carried weight. I didn't respond to my parents directly. I let everything go through Mercer. He built the case the same way he always did, methodically, without emotion, anchored in facts that didn't shift, no matter how they were framed. We compiled everything. Medical records confirming my grandfather's cognitive clarity at the time the trust was signed. Statements from the home nurse documenting who had been present during his care. Financial records showing who had paid for what and when. And then there were the messages. My mother's calls, my father's emails, Chloe's texts. One in particular stood out. It had been sent late at night, likely in frustration, and then unsent seconds later, but not before I had seen it. If she doesn't cooperate, Chloe had written, "Tell Dad to push the dead angle. She'll fold if she thinks everyone will find out." The dead angle. That was the first time I understood what had been driving all of this. Mercer confirmed it within days. My father's business wasn't stable. Lines of credit had tightened. Personal guarantees were being called in. The house wasn't just an asset to him, it was an exit. Everything clicked into place. The urgency. The 2-day deadline. The insistence that Chloe needed the house for her future. It had never been about her future. It had been about his survival. The hearing took place on a Thursday morning. The courtroom was smaller than most people expect. No dramatic lighting, no raised voices, just rows of wooden benches, a judge who had seen every version of family conflict imaginable, and a space where stories either held together or didn't. My parents sat at one table. I sat at another. Chloe between them, dressed in pale blue, her posture straighter than usual, like she could hold everything in place if she didn't move. Their attorney spoke first. He painted a picture that almost sounded believable if you didn't know the details. A concerned family, a grieving daughter, a situation that had spiraled because one person couldn't handle the responsibility placed on her. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Mercer stood when it was his turn. He didn't argue the story. He replaced it. Dates, documents, records. He walked the court through the trust formation step by step, showed the signatures, the notarization, the timing. Then he moved to care. Not what I felt. What I did. Pharmacy logs, maintenance invoices, travel records, the nurse's statement. He didn't say I loved my grandparents more. He showed I had been there more. Then came the recording. My grandfather's voice filled the room again, just as it had in the study. Clear. Certain. Final. "I am not confused," he said. No one interrupted. No one objected. Because there was nothing to object to. Finally, Mercer addressed motive. Not aggressively. Just enough. Financial pressure, timing, the attempt to force me out before any legal review. My father was called to respond. He held it together at first, carefully worded answers, general statements. Then Mercer asked a simple question. "Were you under financial pressure at the time you attempted to assume control of the property?" There was a pause. "Not long, but long enough." "Everyone has pressure," my father said. Specifically, Mercer continued, "Were you seeking immediate control of the property in order to relieve that pressure?" Another pause. This one longer. My father looked at the judge, then at his attorney, then briefly at me. And then he said it. "We needed her to cooperate," he replied, the control slipping just enough, so we could stabilize things. That was all it took. Not anger. Not accusation. Just truth said one step too far. The judge didn't react immediately. She didn't need to. When she ruled, her voice was steady. The trust was valid. The petition was denied. There was no evidence of undue influence. The documentation, she noted, overwhelmingly supported the structure as both intentional and appropriate. She went further. She addressed the attempt to remove me from the property before any legal resolution. She called it inappropriate, pressuring. She ordered them to cover a portion of my legal fees. And she set boundaries, clear ones. No access to the property. No direct contact outside legal channels. Not unless I chose otherwise. The room stayed quiet as she finished. My mother cried. Not softly. Not for effect. For real. Chloe didn't move. My father stood slower than before, his posture no longer as controlled as it had been when this started. They didn't look at me when they left. They didn't need to. 2 weeks later, my father stepped down from a board he had been part of for years. No announcement, no explanation. There didn't need to be one. People understand more than they say. That afternoon, I drove back to the house. The same road, the same turn, the same view of the water opening up between the trees. Nothing about it looked different. That was the point. I unlocked the door and stepped inside. The air felt the same, the quiet felt the same. I set my bag down in the entryway, walked into the kitchen and reached for the same ceramic mug I had held the day everything shifted. The crack along the handle was still there, unchanged. I filled it, stepped out onto the porch, and sat in the chair my grandfather used to favor in the late afternoons. For a long time I didn't think about the court, or the calls, or the words that had been said. I thought about the years before. The small things. The ones no one else had been there for. I didn't win because I fought harder. I didn't win because I outsmarted anyone. I won because I stayed. Because when it mattered, when it was inconvenient, unrecognized, and difficult, I didn't leave. And in the end, that was the only thing that held. If you've ever had someone try to rewrite your role in a story you lived through, I want you to remember this: truth doesn't need to be loud to be final. And before you go, I'd really like to hear from you. Where are you listening from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop it in the comments, and let me know how far this story reached you. We share stories like this every day, real, grounded, and worth your time. So if this one stayed with you, consider subscribing so you don't miss what comes next. Let's keep going together.